Great. Well, as we are bang on 5 o'clock and there's only 25 minutes per workshop, let's get this workshop underway. The wonderful Maggie Tate-Druiff will be leading us and talking about disability and inclusion in outdoor expressions of church, especially Hazelnut in Bristol. Maggie is a final year ordinand at Trinity College in Bristol and part of the Hazelnut Bristol leadership team. Maggie is passionate about inclusion and equipping the church to be a space where all can flourish. And Maggie also loves nature and her cat. And now I'm going to hand over to Maggie.
I do love my cat, that has to go in there. Hi everyone, great to be with you. Let me just see the time. So we have 25 minutes. I'm going to try not to talk for the whole time, but I may talk for the whole time because it's not very long to introduce the topic. I can't see the chat right now, but if you want to put questions in, then we can look at those at the end, or comments. If I say something, you want clarification, we can get to that point. If there's something that's really unclear, I don't mind you unmuting and saying, can you just clarify that? Or maybe putting in the chat and then Pippa can do that. I don't mind being interrupted, but I won't be able to see the chat. So disability and inclusion in outdoor expressions of church. This is where we are going. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between accessibility and inclusion. Then we're going to define disability, which is a bit harder to define. The word normal comes up in that definition. So then we're going to look at what it means to be a normal person, what biblical personhood looks like, and then start to apply those things to what the practical inclusion of people with disabilities might look like in an outdoor expression of church. Outdoor church was mentioned in both the talks this morning. So Andy Atkins talked about land use and church and encouraging people to love nature. Ruth Valeria did the same. She mentioned doing worship in churchyards and local parks, or there's things like Forest Church and Muddy Church that you might have heard of. So it's something that's grown up around COVID as well, with it being a safer space to be outside. So this is sort of focusing particularly with that in mind on how do we then make it accessible for people with disabilities, one of those places of intersectionality that Ruth Valeria talked about. She mentioned gender, she mentioned race, but disability is also a place where accessibility and inclusion for being outside and for worship and for taking care of the environment can be an area where people are marginalised. My own personal kind of where I'm coming to this from, so I've lived with chronic pain for the best part of 9 or 10 years now. And in part of helping to start Hazelnut, or my voice in that space, has often been making us aware of how to be welcoming to people with disabilities before they arrive. Everyone experiences disability differently, but in order for people to access a space, it needs to be welcoming in the first place. So I don't have heaps of experience, but I've been digging into disability theology as part of my studies in training for ordination, like Pippa said. So that's where I'm coming from. You may have comments and experiences that contribute to this discussion. Please do put them in the chat. Great. So Tony Phelps-Jones has written a wonderful book about making church accessible to all. It assumes that churches are buildings, but it doesn't take too much to then apply it to outdoor spaces of worship. And he describes that there's a difference between accessibility and inclusivity. A space might be accessible for people to gain entry, but inclusivity is about the attitudes and activities that we encounter that enable us to feel at home and be fully included in what happens. So someone might be able to get into a space, but are they going to be fully included when we get into that space? So we're going to talk about both those things in this talk. Disability is a little more difficult to define. This is what the UK Equality Act defines disability as. It's quite a wide definition. It says a person with a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on their ability to do normal daily activities is disabled. There are quite a few words in there that are not easily defined. I'm going to lay into the use of one of the words in a bit, but before I do that, I want to say that this act is really important It is crucial and it is so welcome. But I'm going to look at the wording and a little bit of how it portrays how society might view some people with disabilities. This might not be the view held by everyone, but it's one of the attitudes that easily makes its way into church. And that word is normal. But I'm not saying that the act is a bad thing. I'm just looking at the wording. So long term is defined later in the legislation. Long term is 12 months or more. Disability is defined as the effect that an impairment has on a person's ability. So if someone has a visual impairment, their disability is the effect that that impairment has on their ability. The Act gives some case examples, but it emphasises that that's not exhaustive and leaves words like normal, reasonable turns up later on, and substantial very much open to interpretation. Whose normal are we talking about here? And what does normal even mean? We'll get there in a moment. With that very loose definition, it is estimated in the UK, I'm sorry if you're from abroad, this is where my research has been. In the UK, it's estimated that 8% of children, 19% of working age adults, and 44% of pension age adults are disabled. That increases with age, which also reminds us that this isn't just an issue affecting people born with disability. There can be times when we can experience disability. Perhaps you break your ankle, you're on crutches for 6 weeks, you're disabled for those 6 weeks, perhaps, or as people age, as conditions and illnesses set in, it becomes a more widespread thing. So this is not just a minority of people that we're talking about. By pension age here, you've got almost 50%. Of those disabilities, 80 to 90% are hidden. This sunflower lanyard has started to be worn a lot more around here. This was introduced by Gatwick Airport a few years ago as a way of symbolising that people have hidden disabilities and they may need help. So some of those disabilities could be learning disabilities, mental health conditions, mobility, speech, visual or hearing impairments, chronic illnesses. So if someone were to rock up at your outdoor expression of church or your indoor expression, you might not know immediately that they have a disability. 80 to 90% are hidden. And if they're wearing one of these, then that will indicate they might need a bit of help. Or they might not want you to cry, but yeah. So back to that definition then. Here's my beef with the word normal. A physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. Before normal was applied to people, normal came from the angle. It's a building term, that set square there on the left. The normal angle is a right angle. It's the angle that's desirable for the corner of a structure. It needs to be uniform. As we know, no one person looks the same as another, whether we have a disability or not. So when the term started to be applied to people, John Swinton, who's a great disability theologian, I've listed my books at the end if you're interested in further reading, but John Swinton suggests that the term implies that normal is right, desirable, and true. And so that infers that abnormality is somehow undesirable. The Equality Act's definition of disability is based on an expectation that those who can't do normal activities due to an impairment are those who can't do activities that society sees as desirable. So he argues that in our consumer capitalist, fast-paced society, that is often to do with efficiency and speed. And you see that in the Equality Act, where they're trying to show what is reasonable or what is normal. They start to compare how long it takes a person with an impairment compared to someone without an impairment to do something. Again, that's where the legislation is helpful, because in order to live in society, we need to be able to do certain things. But that attitude then creeps its way in. If you can't do what are considered normal things, what does that mean for how you are viewed and how you're viewed in the church? So assumptions like this I've put at the end can create barriers to inclusion for disabled people, often unconscious barriers in society and in the church. So some models of disability then, we've had a definition. A social model would say that instead of people not being right or desirable, it is society that is not right or desirable for disabled people. And it's society's failure to adapt which disables people. So on the left, we've got that poor guy who can't get up those stairs. Society has not adapted to his ability. But on the right, that man is able to operate within his ability because of the ramp. So that would be a social model. That model developed in the 1960s was developed by members of the disabled community in response to the medical model, which had been the predominant model before that. The medical model sees an impairment as needing curing. And while medical intervention is, of course, invaluable for all of us, and particularly for those of us who experience disability often, that attitude has had unhelpful consequences for the church, where we live in a society when healing becomes understood to mean cure. If we go to the doctor with a problem, we expect to get a cure often. Healing, Nancy Iceland said, another great book called The Disabled God, healing has been the churchly parallel to rehabilitative medicine, in which the goal was the normalisation of the bodies of people with disabilities. I'm not going to go into that now, but just a little challenge to how we use the word healing. Are we talking about salvation and the holistic healing of God in a person's life, or are we simply seeking a cure? When we use healing as a word in prayer, when we look at Jesus' healing miracles, is there something more than cure going on? And how do we use that language to be inclusive of all people who haven't experienced healing as cure? Some other negative attitudes before we get to the positive attitude that the Bible can give us to disability that we might encounter in church that often come from misreading the Bible is the linking of disability to impurity. There are some things in the Levitical law in the Old Testament. The linking of disability to sin. In the Gospels, Jesus encounters a blind man, a paralysed man, a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, so she has a chronic illness. And in each of those encounters, sin or faith is often mentioned. But when Jesus meets the blind man in John chapter 9, and the disciples say to him, "Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither." That's not the point here. We can also see sometimes characterizing disability as virtuous suffering. Paul's thorn in the flesh, we think was some kind of affliction. Nancy Iceland calls those spiritual superheroes, but that can be unhelpful, as can segregating disabled people as simply being in need of charity. They're things that you may have seen or you may not have seen, but they come up a lot in disability theology and in addressing how the church reacts to people with disabilities. Alternatively, Scripture gives us a positive relational model through which disabled people are seen primarily as people, not normal or abnormal, and interdependent members of the body of Christ, which is where we're going to go now. So if normal, as John Swinton said, means right, desirable, and true, coming from that right angle in language, what does God tell us is right, desirable, and true about all people? Firstly, as we heard this morning from Ruth Valerio, not this morning, earlier on, anyway, we're made in God's image. We're made as one kind. The animals are made according to their kinds, multiple kinds. Humankind is made as one kind, which has all sorts of consequences for the way we see divisions. But for these purposes, we're not made as normal or abnormal, disabled or non-disabled. We're made as one kind. We're blessed by God to care for the rest of creation, and we are made male and female. Our bodies matter. And of course, when we're talking about disability, whether that's a physical or a mental impairment, we're talking about bodies. The mind is within the body. So our bodies matter. We are made in God's image. Secondly, we are made for relationship with one another. It is not good for Adam to be alone, says God. We're made for relationship with God and with the rest of creation. So what is right, desirable, and true, or normal, about these relationships is that no one is alone. The Lord's commandments are obeyed, and that people take care of plants and animals. Adam is tasked to tend and to keep the garden. So we're made in God's image. We're made for relationship. We are loved by God. John's Gospel speaks of abundant life through Jesus. I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. And Jesus came to show that great love that God has for the whole world, the whole cosmos, as we've talked about earlier if you were in the plenary sessions. So that includes all people, whatever their intellectual capacity to profess belief. God's love with the promise of abundant life extends to all creation. So in contrast to society, which we can see can marginalise in some spheres disabled people as not right or desirable in some way, God's love and abundant life is right and desirable for all. That is the message that we as a church have. So we are made in God's image, made for relationship with God, with the rest of creation, and with one another. We are loved by God, and we are interdependent. I think this bit is the one that gives kind of the beautiful imagery of the importance of inclusion in the church. Our bodies become members of a larger body in Paul's description of the church as one body of Christ. Members of the body cannot say to other members that they don't belong. The eye cannot say to the foot, I don't need you. The foot cannot say to the head, you don't belong here. I think he uses different body parts, but get the impression. And even when some members are considered weaker by others, says Paul, these members are indispensable. So while some church members might view disabled individuals as weaker, or those of us who are disabled might sometimes feel weaker, Paul says that's not the case. God has arranged the body and gifted everyone according to God's wisdom. And since baptism into the body and drinking of the Spirit makes us a member of Christ's body, that's available to all. We are not excluded from God's gifts to serve and to be served by fellow members of the church. So, quick summary: if normal implies what is right, desirable, and true, Scripture shows normal personhood to include disabled people, to include all people. You could apply this to a lot of other issues, minority groups. We are made by God for relationship, loved by God, and for those baptised into the church, interdependent members of Christ's body. So what does this look like in context? Hazelnut Community Farm began last September in Bristol. I think there's a workshop after this to discuss more of what happens, but in starting a new outdoor expression of church, we were starting from scratch. We meet in 2 community gardens in Bristol. We only meet outdoors, we don't have a building. And we meet in spaces that we don't own. And in both those places, other people use that space too. So we don't have a huge amount of autonomy over kind of restructuring things, leveling things, that kind of thing. We do have some. When we meet, our main activities are gardening. So our work is our worship. There is freedom for people to sit and chat or to do various gardening tasks, to enjoy the garden. That's our worship side, if you like. And then the second part of our worship is to gather together and to hear a Bible story, that kind of thing. So I'm just going to apply some of the questions that we've been asking about how to include people with disabilities in that space. This is a work in progress. If you have any suggestions as I go through, they would be most welcome. I'm talking primarily in terms of shared community garden here, but some of them can be extrapolated to other outdoor forms of church too. So in the book I mentioned at the start, Making Church Accessible to All, Tony Phelps-Jones, the author, talks about access to truth. We go back to that accessibility and inclusivity. We need to be able to access the space in order to be included. So here are some questions that we've been asking about how people can access that truth, the gospel, which is effectively listed, being loved by God, in relationship, interdependent, made in God's image. How will we discover that we are made by God for relationship, loved by God, and interdependent members of Christ's body, if we're not in a place where we can, first of all, access the physical space? So those first 2 pictures, if you can see them, are the path that leads into our first garden. While the path is flat and there are no steps, it's slightly uneven. So it would be difficult for someone to navigate if they had a visual impairment. That would mean that they needed help to not trip over, or if they didn't have a very sturdy wheelchair. So it's not 100% independently accessible. But the gate is propped open, and that's the best we can do at the moment. Then in the middle, those are our raised beds. This garden we inherited, the raised beds had already been put in. My main beef with this site is that the raised beds are not high enough for someone who uses a wheelchair or who needs to sit down to be able to access them. They're low and we have to bend. I can just about do it with my bad back, but there are some bits on the floor that I just can't get to. So if you're someone who's listening to this thinking, oh, let's put in a raised bed, let's think about helping people to encounter nature, maybe in your church or your garden or whatever, go the whole hog. Don't just build it halfway, build it high enough, if you can, I would say, or get people to build it if someone else is doing that for you. So that's to be worked on. Sitting comfortably to concentrate. So at Hazelnut, we rely on donations. The fourth picture is a new table and some chairs that has been donated to us. This has been a godsend for me. Before we had this, there was nowhere to sit comfortably, and so while I was trying to listen to the Bible stuff, I just couldn't listen because I was in pain. Whereas now there's actually supportive seating. So that's a couple of examples. How are we going to access the truth if we can't hear what is being said? Being outdoors is really difficult to amplify. We haven't yet found a good solution to this. You can get outdoor PA systems with generators, outdoor loops. They cost a lot of money. They need a generator, that kind of thing. Our best solution at the moment is that when we gather, if someone is hard of hearing, we sit them right next to the speaker. And I've had that happen before in a COVID safe way. Understanding metaphorical language. People with certain learning disabilities, things like Down syndrome, or you might have other examples that you know of. Metaphorical language. Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus is my rock. What does that mean? Simplifying our language helps everybody. Reading signs and resources. We have large print available. That also doesn't just help people with visual impairments. We have a member of our community who's dyslexic, and it means that he can read rather than really struggling. Asking for help and clarification. A lot of these things are implicit. So having a culture where it's normal to ask for help helps everybody. Pippa's told me that I've got 5 minutes, probably 4 now, so I'm going to whiz through the next thing. I've basically mentioned that. 3 minutes. Informality. The great thing about an outdoor space is that for people who move around or make noise, it's great. You don't have to sit still in church. That's great for children as well. Something that can be difficult is certain forms of autism or mental health conditions. Social anxiety is something we're seeing a lot, particularly as people come out of lockdown. Having a known routine, making eye contact, casual conversation can be difficult. We have this peace garden, a quiet shaded space where people can escape to if they need to. I've noticed that people take themselves off to it when they need just a bit of space. So that can be helpful to have too. So these are like just the final learning points where we are at the moment. Clear signage helps everyone to know where they are. If they can't hear your instructions, they can see it. If they can't see your instructions, you say them as well so they can hear it. Accessible toilet and communicate that in advance, or people will count themselves out in case they get caught short. Subtitled tour of the space. I'd love to add that to the website. To orient yourself before you come is important for being able to access. We talked about chairs and we talked about a quiet shaded area. Those are the books I mentioned, if anyone's interested, the websites I mentioned. I put my email address just because I'm sure people here will have more experience and I'd love to dig into this. So if you've got any comments, I'd love to hear them. Pippa, is there time for one question?
I think if you can be 1 minute, we've got 1 minute. And thank you, Maggie. That was an excellent introduction to inclusion and disability in outdoor spaces. There was one comment asking you if you're aware of Sam Wells's theology of being with. Do you know much about that? And about how that might interface with disability theology?
It's on my list, but I haven't actually read it. And I don't know if anyone else has read it and would like to comment on that.
Well, I've read a little bit about it, and the concept that is that Jesus spent most of his ministry, most of his life being with people rather than doing things for them, which can be quite an issue with disability and inclusion, being done to, done for. So I think it offers a different model of church that I think is great.
I think I would agree with that. One of my biggest challenges coming to the garden has been the fact that it's all about doing, it's all about planting. And verbally we say that we can sit and be actually modelled. So yeah, that feeds right the way in, and in setting that culture of inclusion, just saying, oh, you can sit over there, you don't have to join in, doesn't actually being with people. And equally, not just giving someone a job that you think they can do. I've had that too. Oh, Maggie, you can do that one. We do it, we do it to children. It's like being treated like a child, and that can happen a lot. So yes, great point, Charles. I can see the chat. Yeah, that does come in.
Well, thank you, Maggie, again. I know that this PowerPoint will be available afterwards for those who want it, and this session is recorded for you to be able to watch it again. It'll be on the Hazelnut YouTube before too long, but thank you again, Maggie. I'm going to let everyone go because you've got 4 minutes to the next one, I think. Thank you.
Right. There's no one in this room, is there?